Lieutenant Sarah Chen crouched behind the crumbling concrete wall as bullets whistled overhead, her heart pounding against her tactical vest. The Navy SEAL team she was embedded with as a combat medic had been pinned down for 3 hours in the abandoned compound outside Kandahar. Their extraction helicopter circled helplessly above as enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. The team leader, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, crawled over to her, his face grim. "We need to fall back. Chen!" he shouted, over the gunfire, but as Sarah looked through a gap in the wall, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. The morning had started like any other routine patrol through the dusty streets of the Afghan countryside. Sarah had joined Bravo Team 6 months ago as part of a new initiative to embed specialized combat medics with elite units. Her medical training was extensive, but she had also completed advanced tactical courses that most medics never saw. The SEALs had initially been skeptical of having a woman on their team, but Sarah had proven herself time and again during firefights and rescue operations, earning their respect through competence and courage under fire. The intelligence briefing that morning had indicated a simple reconnaissance mission to investigate reports of weapons caches in an abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of the village. The compound had been empty for months, according to local sources, and the mission was supposed to be a quick, in-and-out operation to gather evidence and call in airstrikes if necessary. But as soon as the 8-man team had breached the outer perimeter, everything went sideways. The first indication of trouble came when Petty Officer Williams spotted fresh tire tracks in the courtyard, tracks that were definitely not from local civilian vehicles. Rodriguez had immediately called for heightened alert status, but before he could relay new orders to his team, the compound erupted in coordinated gunfire. From at least 6 different positions, the SEALs found themselves caught in a carefully planned ambush, with enemy fighters positioned in elevated positions around the entire perimeter. Sarah had immediately moved to treat Corpsman Martinez, who had taken shrapnel to his leg during the initial barrage, but even as she worked to stop his bleeding, she could hear Rodriguez on the radio calling for immediate extraction. The helicopter pilot reported heavy ground fire and multiple rocket-propelled grenades, making landing impossible until the area could be secured. Sarah finished bandaging Martinez and helped him to a more protected position behind a concrete pillar, but she could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. The enemy fire was not random or panicked, but showed clear signs of military training and coordination. Someone was directing their movements, and they seemed to know exactly where the SEAL team had taken cover. Williams reported at least 12 hostiles visible from his position, while Petty Officer Jackson counted 8 more from the eastern approach. The ammunition expenditure was enormous, and Sarah realized they were facing a much larger force than anticipated as the firefight continued. Sarah noticed something that chilled her to the bone. The enemy was not trying to overrun their position or force a quick, decisive engagement. Instead, they seemed to be herding the SEAL team toward the southern wall of the compound, where the terrain offered no cover and no escape routes. It was a classic pincer movement designed to trap them in a kill zone where superior numbers could overwhelm even the most elite fighters. Rodriguez was an experienced operator with over 15 years in special operations, and Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed their tactical situation. The team was outnumbered at least 3-1. They were running low on ammunition, and their position was becoming increasingly untenable. The smart military decision was to call for immediate extraction, even if it meant fighting their way to a more defensible position several hundred meters away. But as Sarah peered through the gap in the concrete wall using her field glasses to scan the surrounding area, she saw something that changed everything. A small cluster of buildings about 400 meters to the east caught her attention, and what she saw there made her stomach drop. The buildings were part of a local school complex, and through the windows, she could clearly see the silhouettes of children huddled together in what appeared to be a classroom. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The enemy had not just ambushed the SEAL team, they had deliberately chosen this location, knowing that American forces would be reluctant to call in airstrikes or use heavy weapons with civilians in the immediate area. The children were not accidental casualties waiting to happen. They were human shields being used as part of a calculated military strategy. Sarah grabbed Rodriguez by the shoulder and pointed toward the school buildings. "Sir, we have civilians in the area. At least 20 children visible in that school complex." Rodriguez followed her gaze and his expression darkened. As he understood the implications, the enemy had chosen their battlefield, carefully knowing that the presence of children would limit American response options and potentially force the SEALs into a ground withdrawal that would expose them to devastating fire. The tactical situation was now clear. The enemy was using the school as both a shield and a psychological weapon, knowing that American forces would never risk civilian casualties, even to save their own lives. Rodriguez was already reaching for his radio to call for immediate retreat when Sarah noticed movement near the school that made her blood freeze. A group of armed fighters was moving toward the school building itself, and she realized with growing horror that the children were about to become more than just human shields. They were about to become hostages or worse. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see a group of local children trapped in a school building directly in the line of fire between the SEALs' position and the enemy stronghold. The insurgents were using the children as human shields, knowing the Americans would never risk civilian casualties. Rodriguez was already calling for retreat when Sarah noticed the fallen sniper Martinez lying motionless. 20 feet away, his M24 rifle still clutched in his hands. She had trained extensively with long-range weapons during her Medical Corps advanced training, but had never fired in actual combat. The enemy was systematically moving closer to the school, and Sarah realized they had maybe 10 minutes before those children would be caught in a devastating crossfire. The school building was a simple two-story concrete structure typical of rural Afghan construction, with large windows that had once allowed natural light into classrooms, but now served as perfect observation points for anyone watching the unfolding battle. Sarah could count at least 15 small faces pressed against the glass on the second floor, their eyes wide with terror, as gunfire echoed around the compound. The children appeared to range in age from perhaps 6 to 12 years old, and Sarah could see a woman who was likely their teacher trying to keep them away from the windows while simultaneously looking for escape routes that simply did not exist. Martinez had been their designated marksman, a role that required not only exceptional shooting skills, but also the ability to read battlefield conditions and identify high-value targets from extended range. He had taken a bullet to the shoulder during the initial ambush and had been unconscious for nearly 20 minutes, but his breathing was steady, and Sarah could see no signs of life-threatening injury. The M24 sniper weapon system lying beside him was a precision instrument capable of accurate fire out to 800 meters in the right hands, and Sarah knew that in the current tactical situation it might be their only hope of breaking the enemy coordination. Her training with long-range weapons had been part of an experimental program designed to give combat medics additional capabilities in special operations environments. The theory was that medics often found themselves in positions where they could observe enemy movements, while treating wounded soldiers and additional marksmanship skills could prove valuable in extreme situations. Sarah had excelled in the program, completing advanced courses at both Quantico and Fort Benning, where she had consistently scored expert ratings with multiple weapon systems, including the M24, but training on a controlled range with paper targets was vastly different from combat shooting, where adrenaline stress and the knowledge that missing could mean death for innocent civilians created psychological pressures that no amount of practice could fully simulate. Sarah had fired thousands of rounds in training scenarios, but she had never taken a human life, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her as she watched the enemy fighters moving with increasing boldness toward the school building. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah could see that Rodriguez was making the correct military decision in calling for immediate withdrawal. The SEAL team was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in an increasingly untenable position with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of reinforcement. The rules of engagement were clear when civilian lives were at risk. American forces were required to minimize collateral damage even at the cost of tactical advantage. Through her binoculars, Sarah began to identify the enemy command structure and realized that their coordination was coming from three key positions: a sniper on the roof of a building approximately 300 meters to the northeast was directing fire and seemed to be in radio communication with other positions. A machine gun team positioned behind a low wall was providing suppressing fire that kept the SEALs pinned down, while a rocket-propelled grenade operator was moving between positions and appeared to be preparing for a final assault on both the American position and potentially the school building itself. The enemy strategy was becoming clear. They intended to use the children as leverage to force the Americans into a withdrawal. But Sarah suspected their ultimate goal was even more sinister. The presence of international media in the region meant that any incident involving civilian casualties would generate massive propaganda value for the insurgent cause. Whether the children lived or died, the enemy would claim victory either by forcing American retreat or by blaming American forces for civilian deaths. Sarah watched in growing horror as armed fighters began surrounding the school building itself, moving with the confidence of men who knew their enemies could not respond. With overwhelming firepower, the children at the windows were becoming increasingly agitated, and Sarah could see the teacher frantically trying to move them to interior rooms. But the building design offered little protection from small arms fire, and absolutely no protection from rocket-propelled grenades or other explosive devices. Rodriguez was now actively coordinating the withdrawal plan with his team members, assigning sectors of fire and movement routes that would allow them to reach a more defensible position several hundred meters to the south. The plan was tactically sound and represented their best chance of survival, but Sarah knew that implementing it would mean abandoning the children to whatever fate the enemy had planned for them. The weight of the M24 rifle seemed to call to her as she calculated distances and wind conditions with the automatic precision that months of training had ingrained in her muscle memory. The primary targets were clear: the sniper coordinating enemy fire, the machine gun team suppressing American movement, and the RPG operator who posed the greatest immediate threat to both the SEAL team and the school building. The shots were all within her demonstrated range, and the environmental conditions were actually favorable with minimal wind and excellent visibility. But as Sarah considered the tactical possibilities, she also understood the broader implications of her potential actions. Taking those shots would mean crossing a line from healer to killer, from someone who preserved life to someone who took it. The Hippocratic oath she had sworn as a medical professional seemed to conflict directly with the immediate tactical necessities of the situation, and she found herself facing a moral decision that no amount of training had prepared her for. The sound of children crying carried across the compound on the desert wind, and Sarah realized that time was running out for everyone involved. Without waiting for orders, Sarah sprinted across the open ground, dodging bullets. As she reached Martinez and checked his pulse, he was unconscious, but alive. She grabbed the M24 and quickly assessed the tactical situation from her new position. The enemy had three main firing positions, but there was one sniper on a rooftop who seemed to be coordinating their movements and directing fire toward the school. Sarah steadied her breathing and lined up her first shot the way her instructor had taught her back at Quantico. The crosshairs found their target, and she squeezed the trigger, watching the enemy sniper fall. But as she swung the rifle toward the second position, she realized the insurgents had spotted her location and were now concentrating all their fire directly at her. The sprint across open ground had taken less than 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity as bullets cracked through the air around her head and kicked up small explosions of dust and concrete fragments at her feet. Sarah had relied on the element of surprise and the fact that the enemy fighters were focused on the main SEAL position to make her movement, but now that she had revealed herself by taking the first shot, she knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before they could coordinate effective counterfire against her new position. Martinez stirred slightly as she checked his vitals, and she could see that his shoulder wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. The bullet had passed through muscle tissue without hitting major arteries or bone structure, and his unconsciousness was likely due to blood loss and shock rather than traumatic brain injury. Sarah quickly applied a pressure bandage and positioned him behind a concrete barrier where he would have some protection from small arms fire, but she knew that if the enemy brought heavier weapons to bear on her position, neither of them would survive. The M24 felt familiar in her hands despite the combat stress and adrenaline coursing through her system. The weapon was perfectly zeroed, and Martinez had maintained it in excellent condition with a clean barrel and properly adjusted scope. Sarah had fired this exact rifle model hundreds of times during training, and she knew its capabilities and limitations intimately. The 7.62mm rounds were devastating at the ranges she was facing, and the precision optics would allow her to engage targets with confidence out to 600 meters. Her first target had been the enemy sniper who was directing fire from a rooftop, position approximately 250 meters to the northeast. The shot had been relatively straightforward with minimal wind drift and a clear line of sight. But Sarah knew that eliminating him would only buy her a few minutes before the remaining enemy fighters adapted their tactics. The machine gun team was her next priority, as their sustained fire was preventing the SEAL team from maneuvering, and their position gave them overlapping fields of fire that covered both the American position and the approaches to the school. As Sarah swung the rifle toward the machine gun position, she could hear Rodriguez shouting orders to his team and realized that her actions had created a brief window of opportunity for the SEALs to reposition themselves. The enemy coordination had been disrupted by the loss of their Overwatch sniper, and the remaining fighters were clearly confused about where the precision fire was coming from. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions as the insurgents tried to locate her, but the concrete barriers and rubble around Martinez's position provided excellent concealment. The machine gun team was positioned behind a low stone wall approximately 300 meters to the east, and Sarah could see 2 fighters manning the weapon while a third provided security and ammunition. The gunner was partially exposed as he traversed the weapon to engage the SEAL team, and Sarah knew she had a clear shot at center mass. The range was well within her capabilities and the target was stationary. But as she settled into her shooting position, she could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming rocket-propelled grenades and realized that the enemy was escalating their response. The first RPG impacted against the concrete wall where the SEAL team had been positioned, sending a shower of debris and smoke across the compound. Sarah could hear Williams calling out that everyone was still mobile, but she knew that the enemy had more rockets and would continue to use them until they achieved decisive results. The school building was now directly in the line of fire as the insurgents attempted to flush the Americans from their positions, and Sarah could see children at the windows becoming increasingly panicked as explosions echoed around them. Sarah took her second shot at the machine gunner and watched him collapse backward as the 7.62mm round found its target, but immediately she had to roll sideways as automatic weapons fire began impacting around her position. The remaining enemy fighters had triangulated her location and were concentrating their fire with deadly accuracy. Sarah could hear bullets striking the concrete barriers and ricocheting off metal debris as she sought better cover while maintaining her ability to engage targets. The third priority target was the RPG operator, who had moved to a position behind a burned-out vehicle approximately 400 meters to the southeast. Sarah could see him preparing another rocket and knew that his next shot would likely target either the school building or her own position. The range was at the outer edge of her comfort zone, and the target was partially concealed, but she understood that failing to neutralize him would result in catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. As Sarah lined up her third shot, she became aware that the tactical situation was shifting rapidly around her. The SEAL team was using the disruption she had created to advance on the eastern positions, while the enemy fighters were clearly struggling to maintain coordination without their Overwatch sniper. The children in the school were no longer visible at the windows, which Sarah hoped meant they had been moved to interior rooms with better protection, but she could still hear their voices carried on the wind. The crosshairs settled on the RPG operator, just as he raised the launcher to his shoulder, and Sarah knew she had perhaps 2 seconds before he could fire at the school building. The shot required perfect timing and precision, as any miss would likely result in the rocket being launched at the children. But as her finger tightened on the trigger, she heard the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles approaching the compound at high speed and realized that the tactical situation was about to become even more complicated. The sound of diesel engines and grinding gears indicated at least 3 heavy vehicles moving rapidly toward the compound from the main road, and Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that enemy reinforcements were arriving just as she was, beginning to turn the tide of the battle. The timing could not have been worse, as the SEAL team was still pinned down, despite her successful elimination of 2 key targets, and the children in the school remained in immediate danger from both crossfire and deliberate targeting. Sarah forced herself to focus on the immediate threat and squeezed the trigger, sending the 3rd round downrange toward the RPG operator. The shot felt perfect as it left the barrel, and she watched through the scope as the insurgent fighter spun and fell backward, the rocket launcher clattering uselessly to the ground beside him. But even as she confirmed the hit, Sarah could see dust clouds rising from the approaching vehicles and knew that her brief tactical advantage was about to evaporate. The vehicles were moving in a coordinated formation that suggested military training rather than the random arrival of civilian reinforcements, and Sarah could make out the distinctive profiles of what appeared to be modified pickup trucks with heavy weapons mounted in their beds. The lead vehicle was approximately 1 kilometer away, but closing fast, and she estimated they would reach the compound perimeter within 3 minutes. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio as he coordinated with the extraction helicopter pilot, who was still circling overhead, unable to land due to the ongoing ground fire. The pilot reported that he could see the approaching vehicles and confirmed Sarah's assessment, that they appeared to be technical vehicles armed with heavy machine guns or possibly anti-aircraft weapons. The helicopter would be forced to withdraw to a safe distance until the ground situation could be stabilized. Sarah realized that her position behind the concrete barriers was about to become untenable, as the approaching vehicles would have clear lines of sight to her location and the firepower to destroy her cover. The M24 rifle was devastatingly effective against individual targets, but would be useless against armored vehicles or crew-served weapons, and she knew she needed to either relocate immediately or find a way to eliminate the vehicular threat before it could deploy. The remaining enemy fighters in the compound seemed to understand that reinforcements were arriving, and their fire became more aggressive and coordinated as they attempted to keep the SEAL team pinned down until the vehicles could arrive. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions and realized that there were more insurgents in the compound than they had initially estimated. The enemy had clearly planned this ambush carefully, and the approaching vehicles were probably part of the original tactical plan. Martinez began to regain consciousness beside her, and Sarah quickly briefed him on the tactical situation while keeping her eyes on the approaching dust clouds. The wounded sniper was groggy but alert enough to understand the gravity of their situation, and he pointed toward a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of the compound. The ditch would provide concealment and a covered route toward the school building, but it would also put them closer to the enemy positions. Sarah made a rapid, tactical decision and began preparing to move from her current position, but as she gathered the M24 rifle and extra ammunition, she noticed something that made her pause. The children in the school building were no longer completely hidden from view, and she could see small faces appearing briefly at windows on the ground floor. The teacher was apparently trying to evacuate them from the upper level, but the ground floor windows were even more exposed to gunfire from multiple directions. Lead vehicle was now close enough that Sarah could make out individual figures in the truck bed, and she could see that they were indeed carrying a heavy machine gun that would be capable of devastating fire against both the SEAL team and the school building. The tactical mathematics were becoming increasingly grim, as the Americans would soon be facing overwhelming firepower from multiple directions with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of reinforcement or extraction. Rodriguez was now calling for immediate withdrawal to a fallback position approximately 800 meters to the south, where the terrain offered better defensive advantages, but Sarah realized that implementing that withdrawal would mean abandoning the children to whatever fate the enemy had planned. The approaching vehicles would reach the school building within minutes of arriving at the compound, and there would be nothing to prevent them from either taking hostages or eliminating witnesses. Sarah could hear the children crying more loudly now, as the sound of approaching engines grew louder, and she knew that the teacher was probably struggling to keep them calm while searching desperately for escape routes that simply did not exist. The school building had been constructed as an educational facility, not a fortress, and it offered virtually no protection against military weapons or determined attackers. The weight of decision pressed down on Sarah as she realized that the next few minutes would determine not only the fate of the SEAL team, but also the lives of innocent children who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The M24 rifle in her hands represented precision and lethality, but it was ultimately just one weapon against an increasingly overwhelming enemy force. As the first vehicle crested a small rise and came into clear view, Sarah could see that her worst fears were being realized. The truck was indeed carrying a heavy machine gun, and there were at least 8 armed fighters visible in and around the vehicle, with more vehicles following close behind. The enemy force was larger and better equipped than anyone had anticipated, and the tactical situation was rapidly becoming hopeless. But as Sarah watched the approaching threat, she noticed something about their formation and approach route that gave her a desperate idea. Sarah methodically worked through her targets even as concrete exploded around her, each shot precise and calculated. As she had been trained, her second shot took out the machine gunner who had been suppressing the SEAL team, and suddenly Rodriguez and his men could move again. The third shot eliminated the rocket launcher operator who had been preparing to fire at the school building. With the enemy coordination broken, the SEALs advanced rapidly, clearing the remaining insurgents and securing the area. Sarah maintained overwatch until the last hostile was neutralized, then finally allowed herself to breathe. As the children were safely evacuated and Martinez was loaded onto the medical helicopter, Rodriguez approached her with a look of profound respect. "Chen," he said, "you just saved not only those kids, but probably all of us." Sarah simply nodded and handed back the rifle, knowing that sometimes a medic's duty to preserve life meant being willing to take it. The desperate idea that had formed in Sarah's mind as she watched the approaching vehicles was based on a critical observation about their route and formation. The lead truck was following the main road, which curved around a small hill before reaching the compound, and there was a brief section where the vehicle would be exposed on elevated ground with no cover for approximately 200 meters. The driver would be focused on navigating the terrain, and the gunner would likely be scanning for targets rather than watching for threats from unexpected angles. Sarah realized that if she could reposition herself to a specific pile of rubble approximately 100 meters to her northeast, she would have a clear shot at the lead vehicle's fuel tank or engine block. The M24 rifle was certainly capable of penetrating the thin metal of a civilian truck conversion, and a well-placed shot could potentially disable or destroy the vehicle before it could deploy its heavy weapons. The risk was enormous, as moving to that position would expose her to fire from multiple enemy positions, but the alternative was watching helplessly as overwhelming force arrived to massacre both the SEAL team and the children. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed extra ammunition and began moving toward the rubble pile using whatever cover was available while keeping the M24 ready for immediate use. The enemy fighters in the compound were still focused primarily on the SEAL team positions and had not yet identified her new movement, but she knew that would change quickly once she opened fire from the new location Martinez was. Conscious enough to provide covering fire with his sidearm, and she could hear him engaging targets to draw attention away from her movement. The sprint to the rubble pile took nearly 2 minutes of careful movement between cover points, and by the time Sarah reached her new position, the lead vehicle was already beginning its approach up the exposed section of road. She quickly established a stable shooting position and began calculating the complex ballistics required for the shot. The target was moving at approximately 40 kilometers per hour over uneven terrain, and the range was just over 300 meters with a slight crosswind that would affect bullet trajectory. Through the rifle scope, Sarah could see the details of the approaching threat with crystal clarity. The heavy machine gun mounted in the truck bed was a Soviet-era DSHK capable of devastating firepower against both personnel and light structures. The gunner was a bearded man in his 30s wearing military-style clothing, and he was already scanning the compound for targets while other fighters prepared to dismount once they reached the perimeter. The driver was younger and seemed nervous as he navigated the rough road, but he was maintaining steady speed. Toward the compound, Sarah steadied her breathing and led the target slightly to account for its movement and the bullet travel time. The shot would need to be perfect as she would only get one.